We have with us Mr. Raymond Vickery, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce and Trade Development, speaking exclusively to NDTV. So thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking to NDTV World.
Thank you for having me.
My first question, sir, we speak at a time when the U.S. elections have moved to the next decisive phase. There's just about 2 months to go. Before we get into the specifics about the India-U.S. relationship and how India views it right now, and the election also, and the candidates, how do you see the election right now as it is poised, just about 2 months to go?
Well, it is a completely changed and different situation. President Joe Biden stepping back, Vice President Kamala Harris stepping up has changed the equation entirely. I think that the president had done a great job bringing the economy in for a soft landing, getting infrastructure going and so forth. But the reality was that that first debate indicated that the president did have difficulties, particularly engaging. That has been wiped away. Kamala Harris did a great job at the convention. Her first interview with CNN was very good. And people think now that the debate, which is coming up next Tuesday, she'll be able to hold her own against Donald Trump. And it is those kinds of perceptions which have energized the base of the Democratic Party, particularly women of color, young people, people who are interested in some changes in foreign policy, particularly in regard to Gaza. So right now we have a neck-and-neck race, but if you look at polls, and polls are not always accurate, but what they do show is trends. And whether you look at national polls, you look at battleground polls, what you see in terms of a trend is the different situation I indicated, which is moving in favor of Vice President Harris.
I know you're a Democrat and you speak from that position, but how do you see now the Democrat camp being energized after Kamala Harris coming in, after a record amount of funding she's able to generate and raise, and most importantly, what's the kind of strategy that Democrats have now in these last 7-8 weeks?
Well, it all comes down to turning out the vote, what we call Go TV, get out the vote in the United States. And you have to have the cadres at the local level who will do the knocking on doors, the making of calls, the giving of rides to the polls.
Is that system now been completely re-energized with Kamala Harris coming in?
Oh, yes, it has been. We've got people coming into headquarters all across the United States looking for yard signs, wanting to know how they can help. Whereas before, people were saying, yeah, I will vote for the president, but maybe I've got something else that I need to do between now and November the 5th. And that's a completely different situation. Now, we have a lot of undecided voters in the United States as well. I think that's a reflection of the fact that Kamala Harris is not known well nationally. So while people might have had their minds pretty well made up when the known quantities of President Biden and Donald Trump were there, now you have somebody new, and people are saying, well, I'm undecided. I want to take a look. And that's been estimated as much as 15 to 20% of the voters, which is a huge number.
Just 2 months before the election.
2 months before the election. In my view, that requires the kind of energy we're talking about, because those undecided people are not going to decide just on who does better on that debate on Tuesday. They're going to say, what are their friends and neighbors telling them about the candidates? And
or some would say, what is the candidate themselves putting out in terms of agenda? Is that an area that you feel that as a Democrat, maybe more needs to be done in terms of crystal clear agenda that what Harris stands for?
There's no question that we have to put meat on the bones. the whole campaign of Vice President Harris has to be premised on looking forward. And that premise requires two things. It requires the kind of hope and enthusiasm, optimism about the future, but it also requires some knowledge of what that future is likely to look like. And as the campaign has gone on, there has been more meat put on the bones. It's no surprise that we haven't had the kind of detail on websites and in other places about the platform because of the change personnel involved. But if you look at the economic proposals, they are populist in nature, $6,000 credit for newborn children, getting the child tax credit back to where it was during the pandemic, a provision on housing to be able to give a $25,000 grant for the first time, capping healthcare costs, drug costs particularly. So as we go along, there is going to be more meat, but there has to be that. For example, I would say, let's take the question about fracking, on which the Vice President has changed
her stance.
Her stance on that. You have to not only say to people, I've changed my stance, you have to say why, and I expect to hear more about that as to why it fits into an agenda on fighting climate change and helping the environment.
You know, when you talk about these two candidates, if one were to speak from an India point of view, my audience, our network point of view, one of the candidates, that's Kamala Harris, traces her roots to India. When you talk about the other candidate, there's a perception that Donald Trump has a good equation with India. He's come out very publicly saying on several platforms in the last couple of weeks, spoken about Indian Americans and stuff, and there's a perception that Donald Trump had a very good presidency when it comes to India, specific to that. So in that context, I want to ask from you this question that there's a trend, even though it may not be significant, there is a trend that some Democrats may be moving towards the Republican camp for two reasons. One, because they feel that Donald Trump was good for India specifically, and secondly, because they just are unclear about Harris's agenda.
Well, first of all, in regard to Donald Trump generally, there is a nostalgia which is not necessarily rooted in reality. And people generally like to look back and think that there was a golden age at some time when we didn't have as many problems as we do. When you go back into it, you find that those golden ages, so-called, don't hold together. That's certainly true with the Trump presidency, when there was an abject failure, for example, in regard to meeting the pandemic. On U.S.-India relations, it is true that Donald Trump made a trip over here. And in my view, Prime Minister Modi and Minister Jaishankar played him like a fine violin. And that is, they knew that he liked big crowds. They gave him a big crowd. They knew he liked adulation. They showed him some of that. And consequently, the president said the right things. But if you look at the people who...
No, that's the optics. That's the optics, Mr. Vickery. But I'm asking you this because that politics is also about perceptions. It's not just about, hard realities. It's not just about agenda. You yourself said that, Kamala Harris' campaign till now has been a lot about, the feel-good vibes, so to say, and you want meat on the bone to also come in. So if you talk about those vibes, those optics, those perceptions, that is the reason why I mentioned Donald Trump. But if one were to specifically ask about which of the two candidates are better for India, in your assessment, what do you think could be the top two things that a Harris administration would bring to India?
Well, I think what Vice President Harris brings is exactly what Joe Biden has brought, and that is an all-in relationship between the two greatest democracies in the world. If you look at the way in which the G20 happened, the cooperation that was given with India to make that a complete success. If you look at the way in which we have cooperated on issues like terrorism, if you look at the way in which we have gotten together in the Quad vis-a-vis China, you see on all those as a confluence of interest that has not demanded a quid pro quo for the kind of relationship we need with India. If you look at Donald Trump, what you see
is a transactional
relationship. A transactional approach. What's in it for me and mine? It's America first. And it's gotten even worse since the term which he served. You now see a tariff policy which is going to apply to friend or foe, will apply to India as well as others, which is to try to ring fence the United States economy from other economies, such as growing with China. I think particularly in the Harris administration, you're going to see a taking up of the kind of economic interaction which we have referred to as friend sourcing, and that is trying to shift supply chains from China to India, to look at the programs we have in regard to chip making. We both have it, but that can be sliced and diced so that we are cooperative rather than competitive in those areas. So I see on the specifics, particularly in regard to the economy, in regard to what happens with China, what happens with terrorism, that you will see the continuation of the all-in policy, which has been prominent for the past 4 years. And really, if you look at the specifics, far surpasses that of the kind of optics that you've talked about that occurred during the Donald Trump presidency.
Administration, yes. So essentially 3 buckets as far as U.S.-India relations, whether it is the people-to-people exchange and ties, where you talk about immigration and those contentious issues, strategic, where one talks about the China factor, and the economic aspects, where are we looking at a more protectionist landscape. If one were to speak about the immigration aspect, it's a key election issue on which, in fact, the election is practically being fought on. Do you think that, how does this change the landscape when you talk about India? Because we're a very significant stakeholder, because we get impacted. Whether you talk about the legal immigration part, which has now gotten mixed up with the entire illegal immigration issue into one giant problem, which isn't the case.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And there's no question that even though there is some Indian American support in the United States for Trump, all of our surveys indicate about 80% of that vote is going to go to Democrats. And rightly so, because if you look at what the Trump foreign policy is, it's anti-foreigner. And the distinction between legal immigrants and illegal immigrants gets very foggy in his view. And it's very important in U.S.-India relations because of H-1B visas and the need to have people who, particularly in technical fields, be able to move back and forth between India and the United States. Well, we've already seen the kinds of problems we have had, particularly in the Trump administration, with visas and granting those. And I believe, even though it's not perfect, we've made a lot of progress in the last 4 years in doing it. And you don't find that kind of rhetoric which is going on with the Harris campaign. Indeed, with Harris, with her Indian background,
yes,
it'd be a bit much, wouldn't it, to talk about your own mother as having transferred to you family values and values which are very Indian in nature, and at the same time say, oh yeah, but foreigners will be taking our jobs, and we don't know if they're going to be able to be true Americans and so forth. So I think that on that ground, the people-to-people kind of ground, as well as the economic and strategic sides, that there's a real difference between these two candidates.
What about the trade aspect, specifically from a free trade agreement point of view? It's been on the table for so long. Many discussions have happened. Do you think that the Harris administration could probably, one of the hallmarks could be an FTA with India?
Well, I've advocated that for years, as you may know, and I've written articles on it and so forth, and it seems to me that we have to be able to do it. I think the reality is on both sides that there is a rise in protectionism, whether it be Make in India or Buy American, which cuts against a FTA coming into being anytime soon. I worry about what's happened with the World Trade Organization. The United States bears a lot of responsibility for that organization not functioning the way it should have. And India has really been a more active advocate for the WTO and multilateralism, perhaps, than many in the United States. So yes, there's an opening, and India has shown in signing framework agreements that aren't really FTA agreements, but do liberalize its readiness to go forward. So I think, yeah, we can make some progress, but the idea that either side is going to open up. On the Indian side, the agricultural sector is a real problem. I don't think the United States is going to go forward with an FTA unless the agricultural sector in India is opened up too, and as you well know.
So that's an area where there's convergence between the Republicans and Democrats as far as the FTA issues are concerned.
Unfortunately.
Mr. Vickery, thank you so much for taking out the time speaking to.
It's always a pleasure to be with NDTV.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.